"Do look at me, rancher. I found the young Apache girl after everything was taken from her." His ranch was modest, with a few horses, some cattle, and a small wooden cabin that had seen better days. Life had taught him to be careful, to trust little, and to respect the land that provided for him. He was a quiet man, the kind who spoke only when necessary, and when he did, his words were measured, full of the weight of experience. He knew the desert could be unforgiving, and he had learned that survival required more than just skill. It required patience and awareness. One hot afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, Elias decided to check the fences along the far side of his property. The wind was harsh, whipping at his hat and stinging his eyes, and the dry, cracked ground made every step a challenge. He walked slowly, his boots crunching over the gravel, his eyes scanning for broken wires or signs of animals slipping through. The ranch was usually quiet, except for the occasional caw of a crow or the distant call of a hawk. But today, there was something different. A faint rustling came from the bushes near the creek bed. Elias froze, listening carefully. The sound was soft but distinct, like someone trying not to be noticed. Curiosity and caution pulled at him at the same time. He had seen many things in his life: wild animals, wandering travelers, even the occasional outlaw. But the desert had a way of hiding surprises. He moved slowly, keeping low behind a small ridge until he could see the source of the noise. There, partially hidden by the dry branches, was a girl. She looked no older than 12, maybe 13. Her hair was dark and tangled, her clothes worn and torn, and her small frame seemed almost swallowed by the wild landscape around her. She had a look of fear in her eyes, but also something else, something that caught Elias off guard. It was a glimmer of determination, a spark of life that refused to be snuffed out even after all she had endured. Elias stopped a few feet away and watched. The girl seemed unaware of him at first, or perhaps she was too afraid to react. She clutched a small bundle of cloth close to her chest, shifting from one foot to the other as if deciding whether to run or hide. Her eyes, wide and cautious, scanned the area continuously, never settling in one place for long. Elias felt a pang of concern. There was no way she could survive out here alone for long. The desert was merciless, and without water, food, and shelter, anyone could be lost to it quickly. After a moment, Elias spoke softly, careful not to startle her. "Hey there," he said, his voice calm and low, carrying just enough to reach her ears without seeming threatening. The girl flinched and her eyes darted toward him. She pulled her bundle tighter and took a step back, warning him silently not to come closer. Elias understood immediately. She had been through something terrible, something that had taught her to trust no one. He didn't want to scare her or force her hand. He simply wanted to make sure she was safe. For the next few days, Elias kept his distance, visiting the area quietly, leaving small gifts for her. A tin of dried beans here, a loaf of bread there, and water carefully placed in a shaded spot. He didn't approach her directly at first. Instead, he made himself visible only from afar, letting her see that someone was watching out for her, someone who could help. Slowly she began to notice him, not as a threat, but as a presence she could rely on. She would peek from behind the bushes, watching him move around the ranch, never speaking but slowly learning that he meant no harm. Elias often thought about what had brought her here. The desert was vast, and it was not easy for a child to wander alone. He imagined the horrors she must have faced. Perhaps she had been separated from her family during a raid or a conflict, or maybe she had lost her home to fire or misfortune. The thought of it made his heart heavy. He had seen tragedy before, but the sight of such a young, fragile person carrying so much pain struck him deeply. It reminded him of his own youth, growing up in a world that demanded resilience and courage, though he had never faced the kind of loss this girl had endured. Gradually, the girl began to respond to his gestures. One day, she left a small piece of cloth near the water he had placed. Elias took it as a sign that she acknowledged his help. Encouraged, he left more supplies and began talking to her from a distance, sharing small stories about life on the ranch, about the horses, the cattle, and the harsh but beautiful land. He never forced himself on her presence. Instead, he let her set the pace, respecting the invisible boundaries she had drawn around herself. Over time, their silent routine became a rhythm. She would leave little signs: a feather, a smooth stone, a stick arranged carefully on the ground, indicating she had been there and had accepted what he offered. Elias found himself waiting for these small gestures, feeling a strange connection grow between them, one built not on words, but on trust, patience, and mutual understanding. He began to see her not just as a lost child, but as a person with her own strength, intelligence, and resilience. She had survived this long on her own, and that was no small feat. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the distant mountains, Elias noticed her venturing a little closer. She stayed near the edge of the creek, still cautious, but she did not run when he approached carefully. He crouched down at a respectful distance, keeping his hands visible, showing he meant no harm. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." For a long moment she stared at him, her eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity. Then slowly she nodded, barely noticeable, as if granting him permission to continue showing his care. From that moment, Elias felt a shift. There was a fragile bridge between them now, built from patience, quiet acts of kindness and understanding. He knew the path ahead would be difficult. Trust was delicate, and fear ran deep. But he also knew that this small, brave girl had endured more than anyone her age should have. She had survived against the odds, and now, perhaps, she could begin to heal, even if just a little, in the presence of someone who genuinely cared. As night fell, Elias returned to his cabin, but his thoughts remained with her. He worried about what dangers the desert might hold overnight, and he hoped she would find a safe place to rest. Sleep did not come easily. He thought about how fragile life could be, how quickly it could be taken, and how remarkable it was that, against all odds, she had managed to survive. He resolved that he would do everything he could to help her, even if it meant facing challenges he could not yet imagine. In the days that followed, their connection grew slowly but steadily. He left more supplies, watched for signs of her presence, and spoke gently from afar. The girl began to show small signs of curiosity, sometimes mimicking his actions or leaving tiny gifts in return. Elias learned patience in a new way, realizing that trust could not be forced, only earned. And the girl, despite the shadows of her past, began to learn that not all strangers were threats, that kindness could exist even in a harsh world. Elias often reflected on the unexpected nature of their meeting. A simple walk along his fence line had brought him face to face with someone who would change his life. In helping her, he discovered a new depth of empathy, a new understanding of courage and resilience. And in her quiet strength, he saw a reminder of the human spirit's ability to endure, even when everything seems lost. The discovery of the young Apache girl became the beginning of a journey, not just for her survival, but for the growth of two lives forever changed by chance, compassion, and the quiet beauty of trust forming in the desert. Days passed slowly in the desert, yet each one brought small victories for both Elias and the young Apache girl. She had begun to trust him just enough to stay within sight while he moved around the ranch, but she still kept a careful distance. Her eyes, once filled only with fear, now held a flicker of curiosity. Elias noticed every little gesture, the way she would peek from behind a bush, the careful arrangement of stones in a line, or the tiny scrap of cloth she left as a signal that she had accepted his food or water. It was not much, but for Elias, these small signs were proof that trust was growing. Elias understood that he had to be patient. He had spent a lifetime learning the rhythms of the land, and he knew that some things could not be rushed. Trust, especially the kind built from the ruins of fear and loss, was one of those things. He began to leave small gifts at regular spots, always visible but at a safe distance. He left water in a shallow bowl shaded by a rock, bread wrapped in a clean cloth, and even small fruits or nuts he gathered from nearby trees. Each gift was left with care, accompanied by soft words, spoken so that she could hear if she chose to, but without pressuring her. The girl began to notice the patterns. She learned that the man who had appeared suddenly in her life was consistent. He did not vanish, and he did not try to chase her away. Slowly, curiosity outweighed fear. One morning, she left a small piece of dried fruit where Elias had left water the previous evening. It was a silent acknowledgement, a sign that she was beginning to communicate in her own way. Elias felt a warmth in his chest, a cautious hope that perhaps he could help her not just survive, but begin to heal. Elias often thought about what had brought her here. In quiet moments, he pictured the terrible events she must have faced. Losing her family, seeing her home destroyed, and being forced to flee into the unforgiving desert. The weight of such experiences on a young child was unimaginable, yet here she was, surviving on her own. Her strength amazed him, and her resilience inspired a sense of protective responsibility within him. He felt that the least he could do was offer her safety, food, and perhaps even a small measure of comfort. Over the next week, Elias tried to make the environment around her safer. He cleared a small area near the creek where she often hid, making sure there were no sharp rocks or dangerous plants. He left extra water in shaded spots and even left small bundles of firewood nearby. He was careful not to approach her directly, respecting the invisible boundary she had set. Each day, he would check the area, speak softly from a distance, and observe her reactions. Sometimes she would flinch, other times she would watch quietly, studying him, learning that he was different from those who had caused her harm. Elias also began to share stories from his own life, spoken from afar so she could hear without feeling trapped. He told her about the ranch, the animals and the land, painting pictures of simpler times when work and nature were the only concerns. He told her about his childhood, the lessons he had learned about resilience and patience, and the people he had known who had taught him about kindness. At first, she only listened from behind the bushes, her wide eyes never leaving him. But slowly she began to recognize a rhythm in his voice, a gentleness that reassured her. One day, Elias noticed a sudden change. The girl, instead of retreating at his presence, stepped closer to the water bowl he had left. She crouched down, hesitating, then slowly took a sip. Elias stayed a safe distance away, watching silently, letting her take control of her own actions. The moment was small, but to him, it was monumental. She had begun to trust him enough to accept the most basic forms of help. It was a step toward connection, and he felt both relief and pride. The girl's curiosity also grew about the ranch. She would peek at the animals from a distance, watching the horses graze, the cows moving slowly across the dusty ground, and the chickens scratching near the cabin. Elias noticed how her eyes would follow the birds as they flew overhead, and he began to leave small things for her to observe. A smooth stone here, a feather there, or the gentle movement of a water trough's reflection in the sun. Each small gift was a way to invite her into the world again, a reminder that life could still hold moments of wonder even after great loss. Elias realized that survival was not just about food and water. It was about hope, about helping her find a reason to keep going. He began to teach her small survival skills from a distance. He demonstrated how to find edible plants, how to track animals without startling them, and how to find shade during the hottest parts of the day. He never forced her to imitate him, but each time he left a small clue, a line in the sand showing tracks, a careful arrangement of sticks indicating a safe path. She learned, absorbing knowledge quietly, building confidence. Despite her growing curiosity, the girl still carried the shadow of fear. She flinched at sudden movements, avoided direct eye contact, and sometimes disappeared for hours, hiding in places she deemed safe. Elias respected her need for space. He understood that the trauma she had endured would not vanish overnight. Each act of patience, each quiet gesture, was a step toward healing. He also reflected on his own life, thinking about the losses he had faced, friends, family, and opportunities that had slipped away. In this shared understanding of survival and resilience, he felt a deep connection forming between them. One afternoon, after days of careful observation, Elias noticed her moving closer than ever before. She crouched near a bush, not hiding entirely, and watched him while he repaired a fence. He spoke softly, telling her what he was doing and why, as if she were an apprentice learning the ways of the land. She listened, eyes wide, occasionally mimicking his movements from a safe distance. For the first time, Elias felt that she might allow him into her life, that the walls of fear and mistrust were beginning to crumble. Their connection deepened slowly. Elias learned to read her signals, the way she arranged sticks, the position of her body, or the glint in her eyes when she recognized something familiar. He began to understand her moods without words, sensing when she was anxious, tired, or curious. In turn, she began to anticipate his gestures, noticing the small gifts he left and accepting them without fear. They were forming a bond built on respect, patience, and empathy, a bond that neither needed words to validate. As days turned into weeks, the girl began to share small pieces of her story. At first, it was gestures and sketches in the dirt, a tree, a river, a small house. Elias listened carefully, piecing together the fragments of her past. She revealed, through her drawings, that she had once lived in a village, with family and friends, and that all of it had been taken from her. Each sketch carried the weight of loss, yet also the strength of memory. Elias marveled at her resilience, amazed that someone so young could carry such sorrow yet continue to survive. Elias knew that the next step would require courage, from both of them. He wanted to approach her directly, to speak face to face, but he understood that trust could not be rushed. Instead, he continued his careful routine, leaving food, water, and gifts, speaking softly from a distance and offering lessons about survival. Each day, the invisible barrier between them became slightly more permeable. The girl began to realize that not all people brought harm, and that some were capable of kindness, patience, and protection. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the desert, Elias saw the girl step even closer. She crouched near a bush, watching him repair a small water trough. For the first time, she did not flinch at his voice. She listened intently, absorbing his instructions and observing his movements. Elias felt a swell of hope and relief. He knew that the fragile bridge of trust they had been building was no longer imaginary. It existed, real and delicate, between two souls who had suffered and survived. The night fell, cool and calm, and Elias returned to his cabin, his mind filled with thoughts of the girl. He thought about the long road ahead, the challenges they would face, and the careful steps required to help her heal. He also reflected on the unexpected gift of her presence in his life. She had come into the desert, lost and frightened, and through patience and quiet gestures, a connection had formed. Elias understood that this was only the beginning. Trust had been earned, curiosity had been sparked, and the possibility of hope now existed where once there had been only fear. In those quiet nights, Elias realized that the desert had not only tested her strength but also his own. He had learned patience in ways he had never imagined, and he had discovered a depth of empathy that came from witnessing pain and choosing to care. The young Apache girl, though still wary and cautious, had begun to open her heart. And Elias knew that with time he could help her not just survive, but find a sense of safety, understanding, and perhaps even joy again. Life on the edge of the desert was never easy, but for Elias and the young Apache girl, it had become a test of patience, courage, and quiet. Resilience. The bond they had been building over days and weeks had begun to deepen, yet both of them knew that the journey was far from over. The girl had started to trust Elias, but the shadows of her past still clung to her. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant sound carried the weight of memories she could not easily escape. Her family had been taken from her, her home destroyed, and the world she had known had vanished. Even with Elias' kindness, the pain was never far from her mind. One morning, Elias noticed that the girl had ventured closer than before. She crouched at the edge of the creek, her dark eyes alert, studying him as he checked the water troughs. For a moment, he almost forgot how fragile this trust still was. He spoke gently, explaining each step of his work, showing her how to repair a broken fence post or refill the water. She watched intently, sometimes imitating his actions from a distance, learning without words. Elias understood that this was more than a lesson in survival. It was a lesson in trust and patience. But as the day wore on, he realized that the harshness of the desert would not wait for them to feel safe. The summer heat was intense, pressing down on the land and testing their endurance. Water was scarce, and the sun seemed to burn hotter with each passing hour. Elias knew that the girl had survived this long by instinct, but instinct alone could not protect her from the dangers that lurked in the desert. One afternoon, while gathering supplies from the cabin, he found signs that she had wandered farther than usual, leaving tracks that led into a narrow canyon. His heart tightened with worry. The canyon was treacherous, with loose rocks, hidden crevices, and the possibility of wild animals. Without hesitation, he grabbed his hat and water, following the tracks carefully, calling softly so as not to startle her. When he found her, she was crouched behind a large boulder, clutching a small bundle of cloth to her chest. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had ventured into the canyon to explore, perhaps to reclaim a sense of control over her own life, but she had underestimated the dangers. Elias approached slowly, careful not to scare her. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here to help. You're safe now." For a long moment she did not move. Then slowly she lowered the bundle and allowed him to step closer. Elias realized that her journey into the canyon was more than curiosity. It was a test, a challenge to herself and to him. She wanted to see if she could navigate the world without relying on anyone, even as she learned to trust him. He understood this instinct well. Survival often required independence, but survival alone could not provide safety, warmth, or healing. He stayed with her, showing her the safest paths, how to avoid slipping on loose stones, and where the shade would protect them from the unrelenting sun. Each step was a lesson, each word a reassurance, and slowly she began to follow his lead. Despite her growing trust, the girl was haunted by memories she could not shake. At night, when the desert was quiet and the wind whispered through the sparse trees, she would draw pictures in the sand, sketches of her family, her village, and the life she had lost. Elias would watch from a distance, careful not to intrude but moved by the depth of her grief. He had seen sorrow before, but the intensity of her loss was unique. It was raw, unfiltered, and yet in her small gestures there was also resilience. She had survived horrors that would have broken many adults, and she continued to face each day with courage. One evening, a sudden dust storm swept across the ranch, carrying sand and debris that stung the eyes and filled the air with a thick haze. The girl, caught outside, froze as the wind howled around her. Elias spotted her immediately and ran toward her, shouting over the roar of the storm. She tried to retreat, instinctively fleeing from the man she had come to trust, but fear drove her toward danger. Elias reached her just in time, pulling her into the shelter of a small rock formation. The storm raged around them, yet in that small protected space, they were safe. The girl clung to him, trembling not from the cold but from fear and exhaustion. Elias held her gently, speaking softly until she calmed, realizing that the desert could be merciless, but together they could face it. After the storm passed, Elias guided her back to a safer part of the ranch. They shared a quiet meal of bread and water, and he encouraged her to rest. That night, as she slept under a small blanket he had provided, he reflected on the harshness of her journey. He understood that survival was not simply about food or shelter. It was about learning to navigate fear, to trust again, and to find courage even when the world seemed determined to take everything away. The girl began to share more of her story in small, cautious ways. She drew pictures in the dirt, told him bits of her life before tragedy, and even hummed a soft tune her mother had taught her. Elias listened without interrupting, understanding that healing was a slow process. The more he learned, the more he realized the depth of her strength. She had endured unimaginable loss and yet continued to survive, each day a testament to her courage. He also began to see that she was not just a child who needed protection, but a person with thoughts, memories, and emotions that deserved respect. As the weeks continued, Elias began to teach her more advanced survival skills. He showed her how to track small animals, identify safe plants, and recognize signs of weather changes. Each lesson was a step toward independence, yet always within the framework of safety. He wanted her to regain a sense of control over her own life, but he also wanted to ensure she knew she was not alone. The balance between teaching independence and offering protection was delicate, but necessary. The girl absorbed every lesson with quiet focus, sometimes asking questions in soft whispers, other times observing silently. One particularly hot afternoon, she attempted to explore a small dry ravine near the ranch. Elias followed at a safe distance, watching her every move. Suddenly, she slipped on a loose rock and nearly fell into a shallow crevice. Elias rushed forward, catching her just in time. The girl's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from the realization of how close danger had come. Elias held her gently, speaking softly about caution and patience. "You are brave," he told her, "but even the brave need help sometimes. That's okay." The words seemed to comfort her. She nodded, understanding that courage did not mean facing the world alone. It meant knowing when to accept help. Despite these moments of danger, Elias noticed that the girl's confidence was slowly growing. She began to venture slightly farther, sometimes leaving small markers for him to see her progress. She would mimic his actions when repairing the fence or fetching water, learning not just the skills of survival, but the rhythm of life in the desert. In these moments, Elias realized that their relationship was no longer one of simple protection. It had become a partnership. They were learning from each other, teaching each other resilience, patience, and hope. Yet, even as their bond strengthened, the girl's grief remained. On quiet nights, she would whisper fragments of memories. The laughter of her siblings, the warmth of her mother's hands, the simple joys of a life she could no longer return to. Elias would sit nearby, listening without interruption, offering comfort through presence rather than words. He understood that these memories were both painful and precious, and that they could not be erased. All he could do was help her carry them, to show her that life could continue even after loss. One day, Elias decided it was time to test her trust further. He invited her to walk alongside him to a nearby spring, a short journey that would expose her to the outside world but still be safe. At first, she hesitated, fear evident in her posture, but with gentle encouragement she followed. Each step was cautious, each movement measured, yet she did not run away. When they reached the spring, she drank deeply from the cool water, her eyes wide with wonder and relief. Elias smiled quietly, knowing that this simple act represented more than survival. It was a step toward healing, toward reclaiming a small piece of life that had been stolen from her. As the sun set that evening, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Elias reflected on the journey so far. The girl had faced unimaginable loss, yet she had not given up. Her resilience, combined with the bond they had formed, gave him hope that she could not only survive but also thrive. The desert, harsh and unforgiving, had tested them both, yet it had also revealed their strength, courage, and capacity for trust. The days ahead promised more challenges, but Elias felt ready. Together, they had learned the importance of patience, caution, and empathy. Together, they had begun to navigate the delicate balance between independence and support. And together, they had taken the first steps toward a future where the shadows of loss could be met with the light of trust and the promise of healing. The days on the ranch grew warmer, and the bond between Elias and the young Apache girl deepened with each passing moment. She had started to trust him more, venturing closer, responding to his quiet guidance, and even mimicking his actions when he worked around the ranch. But despite these small victories, the shadows of her past still followed her. Memories of loss and fear lingered, and she often woke in the night with trembling hands, whispers of the life she had lost floating in her mind. Elias knew that to help her truly, he had to do more than provide safety and food. He had to help her reconnect with a sense of belonging and hope. One morning, as the sun rose over the distant mountains, Elias prepared to take a small but meaningful step. He had heard stories of nearby Apache communities, villages where families survived and supported each other even in harsh conditions. He thought that if the girl could be reunited with surviving relatives, or even find people who shared her culture and language, she might begin to heal more fully. But he also knew that she would not agree to go without trust, and trust was fragile. He needed to approach this carefully, with patience and understanding, allowing her to feel in control of her own life. Elias began by speaking softly from a distance, telling her stories of the surrounding land, of people who had come before, and of villages where families lived and cared for one another. He did not push her, but he gently suggested that there were places where she could feel safe and meet people who would understand her. The girl listened intently, her dark eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity. Slowly she began to ask questions, not with words at first but with gestures, pointing to the horizon and tilting her head, trying to understand what lay beyond the desert she had known as her temporary refuge. Over the next few days, Elias prepared for the journey. He packed a small bundle of supplies, bread, dried meat, fresh water, and blankets. He also gathered information about the villages, the safest routes to take, and the people who might welcome her. All the while, he continued to care for her daily needs, building her confidence and helping her feel capable of facing the journey ahead. It was a delicate balance, teaching her to be self-reliant while also offering reassurance that she would not be alone. The girl began to show signs of readiness. She would follow Elias more closely during chores, carrying small items for him and learning the rhythm of life on the ranch. One afternoon, as they sat together by the creek, she drew a small map in the dirt, indicating where she thought they might find safety. Elias smiled quietly. She was taking initiative, imagining a future where she could belong again. He encouraged her carefully, praising her courage and her intelligence, letting her know that her thoughts and choices mattered. Finally, the day came when Elias felt that she might be ready for a short journey to explore the possibility of connection with others. He approached her gently, kneeling to her level. "I know a place," he said softly, "a place where people might understand you, where you can be safe and learn to smile again. You don't have to go if you don't want to, but I can take you there slowly, step by step." The girl looked at him, eyes wide and cautious. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a slight nod, she accepted. It was a small gesture, but to Elias, it meant that the bridge of trust they had built was strong enough to hold a journey forward. The first steps were tentative. They walked along familiar paths at first, moving toward the edge of the land Elias knew well. He showed her how to recognize safe paths, where to find shade, and how to listen to the sounds of the desert for signs of wildlife. The girl observed carefully, sometimes stopping to point out tracks or objects that she had noticed. Elias praised her for her awareness and intelligence, reinforcing her sense of capability. Each step forward was a lesson not only in survival but in courage, trust, and hope. As they ventured farther from the ranch, the girl began to speak more freely. At first it was simple words, the names of trees, animals, and landmarks she remembered from home. Then gradually she shared fragments of her story, memories of family gatherings, laughter with siblings, and the small joys of daily life before tragedy struck. Elias listened without interruption, offering comfort through presence and understanding. He realized that listening was as important as teaching. Allowing her to share her memories, even the painful ones, was part of the healing process. The journey was not without challenges. They had to navigate rough terrain, climb rocky inclines, and cross dry riverbeds. The sun was relentless, and water had to be rationed carefully. Yet, despite the physical strain, there was a growing sense of purpose in their steps. The girl began to rely on Elias not just for protection, but as a guide through a world that had once seemed hostile and unwelcoming. She learned to trust her own instincts, observing the land, identifying paths, and making small decisions along the way. During one evening rest, as the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Elias shared stories of his own childhood. He spoke of people who had helped him, mistakes he had made, and lessons he had learned. The girl listened intently, occasionally asking questions with shy curiosity. These moments of connection were subtle but profound, bridging the gap between their worlds. Elias realized that in teaching her survival skills, he had also taught her to trust, and in listening to her memories, he had taught her that her past, while painful, could be honored without defining her future. As they neared the outskirts of the Apache community, Elias could see a change in her demeanor. She walked a little taller, her eyes held less fear, and she moved with a quiet confidence that had been absent when they first met. Yet, there was still hesitation. The memories of loss were still fresh, and the thought of entering a village of strangers was daunting. Elias understood this. He slowed their pace, speaking softly about the kindness they might encounter and reminding her that she could take as much time as needed to feel comfortable. When they finally approached the village, a few people noticed them and came forward with cautious curiosity. Elias stayed slightly behind, giving the girl space to observe. She scanned the faces, unsure, but Elias saw her shoulders relax just slightly. He gently encouraged her, whispering that it was okay to be cautious, that she could stay close to him until she felt ready. Slowly, a woman approached, offering a kind smile and words in their shared language. The girl's eyes widened and she took a tentative step forward. Elias smiled quietly, realizing that this was a pivotal moment, not just for her survival, but for her sense of belonging. The woman invited them to sit and offered water and simple food. The girl drank slowly, her hands trembling slightly but with growing confidence. Elias stayed nearby, watching her interactions, careful to intervene only if necessary. The village members asked gentle questions, spoke kindly, and shared stories of their own lives. The girl listened, and gradually she began to respond, sharing bits of her own story. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she was understood, that her experiences, pain, and memories mattered to others. Elias realized that this turning point was more than physical safety, it was emotional healing. The girl had begun to accept the possibility of a future beyond survival, a future where she could reconnect with her culture, her community, and perhaps even her heritage. The journey to this moment had been long, filled with small steps of trust, courage, and patience. He had witnessed her resilience, her quiet determination, and her growing confidence. And in turn, He had learned the profound impact of empathy, patience, and the power of gentle guidance. As night fell over the village, the girl sat quietly near the fire, listening to the elders tell stories of the land, of family, and of history. Elias watched from a distance, feeling a mix of relief and pride. She had come a long way, from hiding in fear on the edge of his ranch, to participating in the life of a community that could offer her safety, understanding, and connection. He knew that the journey was far from over, but this turning point marked a moment of transformation. She had begun to heal, and the seeds of hope had been planted firmly in her heart. Before leaving the village for the night, Elias knelt beside her. "You are strong," he whispered softly, "and you have the right to belong, to be safe, and to be happy. This is only the beginning, and I will be here to help you along the way." The girl looked at him, a small but genuine smile forming on her lips. For the first time, Elias saw the light of trust, courage, and hope reflected in her eyes. It was fragile, yes, but it was real, and it was powerful. The night passed quietly, with the sounds of the village around them. Elias and the girl slept under the open sky, knowing that the desert had tested them both, but that together they had faced challenges, fear, and uncertainty. The turning point had arrived, not with dramatic events, but with the steady accumulation of trust, courage, and human connection. And as dawn approached, Elias knew that the path ahead, though still uncertain, held the promise of healing, belonging, and a future that the girl had every right to embrace. The morning sun rose slowly over the village, casting a soft, golden light across the small adobe houses and dusty paths. The air was quiet but alive with promise. For the young Apache girl, this morning felt different, less like the beginning of another day of survival, and more like a step into a life she had only dreamed of. She had endured so much, faced fear and loss that would have broken many. Yet here she was, sitting quietly, observing the world around her with eyes full of cautious hope. Elias watched her from nearby, noticing the subtle changes in her demeanor. The way she moved with a little more confidence, the slight smile that tugged at her lips, and the way her hands no longer trembled with every small sound. The villagers had begun to accept her presence gently. They spoke with her in soft tones, offered her small gifts of food, and asked her about the life she remembered before tragedy struck. The girl listened, sometimes responding with words, sometimes with gestures. Every interaction was a small step toward belonging, toward reconnecting with a community that could understand her culture, her language, and her experiences. Elias stayed nearby, careful not to dominate the situation, knowing that true healing required that she find her own place in this new environment. For Elias, this moment was bittersweet. He had grown attached to the girl during the weeks they had spent together. Her resilience had inspired him, and her courage had touched him deeply. Yet he also understood that she needed more than just his guidance. She needed a community, people who shared her history and could offer her long-term safety and support. He had done what he could to bring her here, but now he had to step back and allow her to claim her own future. Over the next few days, Elias helped her settle in. He taught her how to communicate with the villagers, how to ask for help when needed, and how to navigate the routines of community life. The girl observed carefully, learning quickly and cautiously. She began to recognize faces, remember names, and even participate in small tasks, like helping carry water or gathering firewood. Each small accomplishment brought her a sense of pride, a reminder that she was capable of more than just surviving. She could live, contribute, and find joy again. One afternoon, Elias took a moment to speak with her privately. They sat beneath a large tree near the edge of the village, its branches offering shade and a quiet space away from the bustling activity. "You have come a long way," he said softly. "You have survived things that no one should ever face. And now you have the chance to belong somewhere, to learn and to grow. I will always be proud of you, no matter what happens." The girl looked up at him, her eyes reflecting gratitude and understanding. She nodded slowly, a gesture of trust, respect, and recognition of the bond they had formed. As the days turned into weeks, the girl began to flourish in ways Elias had only hoped for. She started forming connections with other children, learning the stories, songs, and traditions of her people. She laughed, sometimes softly at first, then more freely, the sound echoing through the village and warming the hearts of those around her. Elias watched from a distance, knowing that his role in her life had changed. He was no longer her sole protector. He had helped her find a safe place, and now she was reclaiming her life with the support of others. Despite the progress, Elias knew that healing was not instantaneous. Some nights, she would still wake with memories of loss, whispering names or stories from her past. Elias would quietly listen from the edge of the room or leave her to find comfort in the familiar surroundings of the village. He had learned that healing could not be forced. It had to be nurtured gently, with patience, understanding, and consistent care. And the girl, with each passing day, was learning to embrace her past without letting it define her future. One day, the village held a small gathering to welcome her formally. Elders shared stories of their own journeys, children invited her to play, and families offered gestures of acceptance. The girl, standing quietly at first, began to participate, her confidence growing with each interaction. She shared small stories of her experiences, drawings of her family, and even a song she remembered from her childhood. The villagers listened, not with pity but with respect and understanding. They recognized her strength, her resilience, and her courage. And in that moment, she felt the first true sense of belonging she had known since the loss of her family. Elias observed the gathering with a mixture of pride and quiet emotion. He had witnessed her growth from a frightened, wary child into a young girl who could trust, who could hope, and who could begin to rebuild her life. He understood that this was the culmination of weeks of patient care, small gestures, and unwavering support. And although the journey had been difficult, the reward was profound. She had found safety, community, and the beginnings of joy. In the evenings, Elias would sometimes sit with her, telling stories of his own past, sharing memories of the land, and listening to her reflections on the village and the people she was meeting. They spoke of dreams, small ones at first, like learning a new skill, and larger ones later, like exploring the wider world beyond the village. Through these conversations, Elias saw the spark of hope in her eyes grow brighter each day. The desert that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving was now behind her, replaced by a world full of possibilities and connections. The girl began to teach Elias as well, in her quiet way. She showed him the small details of the village, the traditions, the ways people supported each other, and the subtle rhythms of daily life. He listened attentively, learning alongside her, realizing that he had gained as much as he had given. Through their shared experiences, they had both grown, he in empathy, patience, and understanding, and she in trust, courage, and resilience. As weeks turned into months, the girl became an integral part of the village. She helped care for younger children, shared her knowledge of survival in the desert, and participated in community rituals and stories. Her laughter, once so rare, became a constant presence, reminding everyone around her of the strength of the human spirit and the power of hope. Elias continued to visit, offering guidance when needed, but increasingly he watched with pride as she navigated her own life with confidence and joy. One evening, under a sky painted with stars, Elias and the girl sat together quietly. She leaned slightly toward him, a simple gesture of trust and affection. "Thank you," she whispered softly, "for everything." Elias smiled, his heart full. He had helped her find safety, hope, and community, but it was her own courage, resilience, and determination that had carried her through. "You did all the hard work," he replied gently. "I only walked with you when you needed me. The rest came from you." In that moment, Elias reflected on the journey they had shared. From the day he first found her hiding in the bushes, scared and alone, to this point where she was thriving, confident, and connected to a community that loved her. It had been a journey of trust, patience, courage, and compassion. He understood that the most profound changes often came not from grand gestures, but from consistent care, quiet support, and unwavering belief in someone's potential. The girl, for her part, had begun to understand the depth of human connection. She had learned that even after tremendous loss, people could be trusted, could offer kindness, and could help restore hope. She had learned to face fear, to accept help, and to find strength in community. And she had learned that even in the harshest of circumstances, the human spirit could endure, grow, and flourish. As the night grew deeper, the village quieted and Elias walked back to the edge of the settlement. He looked up at the stars and thought of the desert, the ranch, and the journey that had brought them here. He felt a sense of completion, not as an ending but as a beginning, for her and for the lives she would touch in the future. The young Apache girl had survived loss, embraced hope, and found belonging. And in helping her, Elias had discovered the power of empathy, patience, and the profound impact one person can have on another's life. The girl would continue to grow, explore, and find her place in the world, carrying the lessons of resilience, trust, and hope with her always. And Elias, knowing that he had played a role in her journey, felt a quiet peace. He had given her a chance at life beyond survival, a life filled with community, understanding, and the possibility of happiness. And that, he realized, was the greatest reward of all. The story ended not with dramatic events, but with quiet, enduring hope. The young girl, once alone and fearful, had found safety, trust, and belonging. Elias, once a solitary rancher, had discovered the transformative power of compassion and human connection. Together they had navigated loss, fear, and the challenges of survival, emerging stronger, wiser, and ready to face the future. And in the quiet desert night, under the vast expanse of stars, there was a sense of peace, proof that even after the darkest times, light, hope, and healing could emerge.